Robbie Lawler was out of control.
This is Double Cross, the murder of Robbie Lawler.
It was going to be an all-out war with him in the middle of it.
A Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal, wherever you get your podcasts. So, Thomas Nicky McConnell is facing a life sentence. There's no other sentence open to him. He's been found guilty of the murder of Gareth Hutch. It's kind of a case of the old gang back together now when he goes back into prison. Jonathan Keogh, his friend for years, is already serving a life sentence for that murder. And Eamon Cumberton. They were a collection of people, friends, loosely gathered together through the umbrella of the supposed INLA or the new INLA, whatever it was they were involved in. They would have been in and out of feuds, all of them, throughout their lives. Chaotic characters who came together at an opportunistic moment to make some money from murder when the Kinahan-Hutch feud kicked off.
Yeah, I suppose what separated... they got called the new INLA, but there was no political ideology or anything of that type behind them. Why they earned that nickname really was because there was a collection of people who had been linked to the INLA, and Jonathan Keogh certainly had particular links to the INLA.
And Gerard Mackin, of course, was involved with them and was photographed with them.
Yeah, Gerard Mackin, of course, was a continuity IRA guy in the north, but he'd also disassociated himself from paramilitarism. So they were really just a collection of individuals,
of criminals for hire, and they were willing to do anything to make their crust.
Yeah, and funnily enough, unlike some of the, I suppose you could consider them players in the Hutch-Kinahan feud on the Kinahan side who had genuine personal grievances and animosity with the Hutches. Plenty of these new INLA guys had good friendships with members of the Hutch family, but it didn't stop them availing of the money the Kinahans were spraying around at the time. A lot of these people, Thomas Fox as well, would have known some of the Hutches all their lives. Jonathan Keogh the same, would have grown up very close to them, would have lived near them, families would have had all sorts of contacts. And Nicky McConnell would have, originally from Ballymun, would have had, I suppose, a reputation like those other guys of being somebody that was a very, very dangerous person.
Now, he has been in custody, I think, since June 2021 when he was returned to Ireland from Turkey, where he had holed up at Kusadasi in some sort of a beach residence.
Yeah.
You'd wonder how he could have afforded that. Maybe life is cheap there or something, or he was continuing to take some opportunities. There was certainly rumoured around one point that he may have been stalking Johnny Hutch, who was out in Turkey. There was a report that Johnny Hutch had been in an apartment, had become scared one night when somebody appeared at the door of his house. He had previously survived an assassination attempt and he jumped, I think, from the balcony and ended up with injuries. He was certainly living in a paranoid, frightening world at that point, and he would go on to then, I think he died in his own home from an accident. But we never got to the bottom of whether it was McConnell that was there at that door or if anybody was that night. But he would have been capable of that and of taking up work in Turkey because he had to keep himself.
Yeah, so Johnny Hutch would have been Jerry Hutch's older brother. I think he was a taxi driver as well. And he certainly jumped out of this window. I think he damaged his legs, maybe broke a leg, but he was, it was straight away put that Nicky McConnell would have been a suspect there because Nicky McConnell was living quite openly in Turkey. Turkey isn't a member of the EU, does have some sort of agreement in place, but extradition isn't straightforward. From what I know, that he was from Ballymun, he had a real base. There's a very big sort of crack cocaine trade and drugs trade in Ballymun, and he certainly had people working for him there, and some of that money was being kicked back to him in Turkey, I believe. Nicky McConnell had, he'd been involved in feuds in Ballymun, a lot of them springing from the murder of his own brother, Ian McConnell, back in 2005. A man known as Stephen Ned Kelly was ultimately convicted of that murder. But there was waves of violence after that. And clearly McConnell's connections with the Kinahans allowed him to have a sort of his own little franchise there. But the Johnny Hutch thing is, like, Johnny Hutch obviously saw somebody coming close to the apartment where he was staying, maybe felt it was Nicky McConnell. You know, in the fullness of time, it's quite possible that it was nothing.
Yeah, because you know, that paranoid, you can hear and see everything that sometimes, or it could have been, as we say, he was certainly openly living in Kusadasi. When you say, just remind me, when you say openly living in Kusadasi, was he posting? He was always he was quite a prolific user of certainly emails and stuff like that, and he would have been kept in contact with certain people over the years.
No, I mean, I think it was well known where he was, but he was certainly...
He was openly living as such.
Yeah, and he had, there was a belief that he was returning at times to Ireland, maybe under another identity, or coming through the north either, which is what a lot of
them did, done. Yeah.
So he certainly had a number of young lads who were continuing to be involved in that business. Now, it's quite sort of relatively low-level street dealing, but there's still a good bit of money involved. Nicky McConnell had been, you know, I think he's over 100 criminal convictions, we heard, when he was finally done for that murder. And a lot of those were for that sort of drugs trade, where you're talking about maybe tens of thousands of pounds worth of drugs. I think at one point he'd been received the sentence for threatening to kill a 28-year-old woman, and for possession of £16,000 worth, or 16,000 euros worth of snow blow. So, like, that's a sort of a lucrative trade. And when he was in there, he would have been rubbing up shoulders with people who were involved in Eamon the Don Dunn's gang. But he would have been a separate kind of organisation. But I think what happened then was Jonathan Keogh he'd been served a sentence in connection with INLA activities, and he seems to have come out of prison sometime in the 2000s and really set himself up as a kind of an enforcer sort of figure. And Nicky McConnell was another one of these guys who was working with him. Bizarrely, Nicky McConnell, I don't know if you remember him being pictured talking to Jim Mansfield Jr. He
came out of some hotel with him, did he not?
Yeah, well, it was Finstown House.
Was it? Yeah, yes, I remember that.
So he was another one of these sort of, figures who ended up providing protection, and Jonathan Keogh was also...
I think he was certainly vying for it, because what happened out there, of course, was this culmination of all these various gangs came together, but ultimately members of the INLA ended up living around Finstown House and the DeSaggers property of the Mansfield family, protecting Jim Mansfield Jr. But they were there was a particular guy called Redgar Byrne. Yeah. And Redgar Byrne had pipped Gerard Mackin to the post of leadership of that INLA grouping. Yeah. And Gerard Mackin, of course, who had a serious history, came from the north and sort of came down the south. He expected to gain that leadership. When he didn't, he seemed to have gone off and set up his own new INLA. Now, McConnell would have been part and parcel of that. And each of the groupings were kind of intimidating one another. Yeah. They all wanted the Mansfield contract because in the end of the day, Jim Mansfield was good for the money.
Yeah, and it was money for nothing really.
It was money for nothing, and they were getting living accommodation and everything. It was a real plush contract. So they were all sort of, vying for that. And I think Mansfield Jr. got out of his depth because he didn't really seem to be able to keep control of what was going on. The paramilitaries nearly took over. Like, he literally opened the doors of his father's mansion to them and they were in and out. But, what he was doing with them that time, was he meeting him or was he offering him his services, or we never got to the bottom of it. But he certainly was photographed with him.
Yeah, and he certainly was, that was really the role of that sort of enforcer, and he had that reputation. In the meantime, there was these constant sort of shootings and violence in Ballybun. I mean, most of it not reaching the point of murder, but a lot of violent attacks, a lot of it around the sort of that crack cocaine business, and he was continuing to be involved in that. But as the Regency shooting, of course, changed everything, and after the Regency shooting, the Kinahans started splashing the cash really and looking for people to bring in all of these sort of hard gangland enforcer types and get them in under their wing and to to, use them to attack the Hutch side. And these guys, Johnny Keogh, Thomas Fox in particular, lived in the North Inner City all their lives. And they, even as the feud had begun, they were still seen drinking in the company, or certainly in the same pubs as members of the Hutch family. There was no sense, I think, at an early point that these were allied with the Kinahans. But we do believe ultimately that they were these new INLA guys were being paid a retainer, which is a very kind of rare thing in gangland history, where most people are paid per job, so they were getting this retainer, and obviously Gareth Hutch became a big target for them and was shot dead.
McConnell, of course, is the fourth individual to be found guilty of the murder of Gareth Hutch. And interestingly, his trial began actually about 16 months ago. It was postponed because one of the judges couldn't continue hearing it. He took a punt to plead not guilty.
Yeah.
Very few do plead guilty to murder, in fairness, but there can be some sort of plea bargains that go on in the background. We've seen a lot of that before the Special Criminal Court, where the state will accept a lesser, perhaps manslaughter or something like that. But McConnell went for trial. And in a way, I think that the evidence at the trial shows why he did that.
Yeah.
And it was because basically the trial heard that McConnell and Jonathan Keogh had used this lookout apartment opposite where Gareth Hutch was living.
Yeah.
And they had used it the night before as a kind of lookout spot to watch the car park below to see when he was going to go to his car. And when he did, they ran at him. There was CCTV footage released which showed two...
It wasn't released, but it got leaked.
It got leaked.
People will remember it because, I mean, it
showed two men pointing a gun at the back of his head, and one of them discharged the firearm. Now, the court heard that Nicky McConnell's gun jammed or certainly didn't go off. Whether that was... There was a lock put on it, I think was unclear.
Yeah.
But Mary MacDonald was the woman who lived in that lookout apartment, and she had been able to tell the High Court last year that she was able to identify Jonathan Keogh as one of the men who used her apartment because she knew him.
Yeah.
But she wasn't actually positively able to identify McConnell. She wasn't 100% sure. And no doubt when he saw that in the book of evidence, he thought he had a running chance at getting off this.
I would have thought so.
But of course, the court said that they couldn't rely on or use Mary MacDonald's evidence, but they were relying on the mobile phone data, which linked McConnell to the other murderers, plotters, and those who had been previously found guilty, and to various vehicles used in the plot. So yet again, a mobile phone, that data, we're constantly seeing that technical evidence, in particular in the Special Criminal Court, is what regularly and nearly always is relied on in these murder trials. Yeah,
I mean, there is a kind of a sense that CCTV, if you don't get, I think somebody was saying to me, if their face isn't in it, you're going to be okay, is what he was describing it as. He said the young fellas believe that if they don't get your face, you're okay. But that hasn't proven true in the Special Criminal Court at all.
And they don't understand the amount of work goes on in the background to, getting to the point where you're in that camera, perhaps where your face isn't underway. But we've seen trials where there have been thousands of hours of CCTV from around the city, which will trace the individual before they ever get to that camera where their face is covered.
Yes. So, and I mean, obviously, part of his conviction arises from the fact that the getaway car that they had put in place, that the court was convinced that Nicky McConnell had directly put in place, that getaway car broke down basically, and there was DNA left there. I presume that if that getaway car had been taken away from the scene, it would have been burnt out, and then another car would have been used to get further away from the scene. But that didn't happen in this case.
And McConnell tried to say actually that he had sold that BMW to somebody who just looked like himself. To his doppelganger, that he'd sold the BMW. That, of course, was a lie, and the DNA linked him.
Yeah. I mean, that is, look, if that car had got away from the scene, he certainly would have been in a good position to fight that case. But it wasn't. And I mean, it's one of these, these organised criminal gangs that get undone by their disorganisation, not having a car that works is, you would think would be a
But do you think in a lot of the cases that they are just so hungry for their payday? That there isn't that, they see an opportunity, they go for it. These are people who are willing to kill to make money. And they're willing to take on any role, be it moving a car, be it, being a getaway driver, anything that'll pay them the money.
I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of these guys, Nicky McConnell, 100 criminal convictions, many of them, some of them at least involve threatening people or selling drugs. The level of investigation that would have gone into a crime like that, which would have been his experience up until this point, would be significantly less than a murder. I think they get surprised when it comes to a murder charge and they see that every piece of phone data that the state can get, they will get their hands on. It's a very painstaking investigation. I mean, you talked about him not pleading guilty. He had no choice in the sense, because there was no way. This is such a clear case of joint enterprise.
Yeah.
That his simple admission that he was there was enough. Now, I think he was quite confident he was going to beat this charge. That they look at all this evidence and say, well, it's all circumstantial.
Yeah.
There's no face, there's no witness. You're putting together, all these things. And I could say, as you said, that I, it's just somebody who looks like me.
Sometimes those, and I think actually Justice Alexander Owens did sort of point out what a ridiculous, lie that was. Sometimes you hear this evidence in court and you can't help yourself. You almost sort of laugh at the idea that somebody thinks that is ever going to be believed. You sort of think, how could they possibly? But they do. When you're in that position, they just believe, I'll just throw this out.
Yeah.
And it'll put the cat among the pigeons, and they won't really know whether it's true or not.
Exactly. And of course, in of itself, it wouldn't be enough to convict him. One piece of CCTV evidence where his face isn't in it and it's a guy of his shape, and that wouldn't be enough. But people can pick out each individual bit of evidence in this case and say, that's not enough, and it isn't. But the state can put all of these individual pieces together and build a picture and convict somebody of circumstantial evidence. We always hear he was just done on circumstantial evidence as if that was a disqualification. But it just simply isn't in an Irish court. It is a totally and utterly valid thing under Irish law to recognise that if there are enough pieces of circumstantial evidence, if put together in a bigger picture, that you can convict somebody of murder beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's what happened in this case again.
And some of the confidence that some of these guys have sometimes, and you can see it in their face, you can see them sitting back almost laughing at the legal process. They have lived their lives, not following the law or not playing fair. And they've probably got away with a huge amount that we don't even know about. So they just keep thinking the luck is going to be on their side, and that they, by telling a lie or by, coming up with some sort of an excuse, that they're going to keep getting away with it. But of course, eventually, and as this case shows, the past does eventually catch up with everybody.
But it certainly can. And if a murder charge is just a different thing. I mean, they no doubt, many of these people have been in cases where, I wasn't in the room with the drugs and I get away with it. But a murder, the resources a state will put into to secure conviction are so different. And you're right, of course, when you're in court sometimes and you hear some of the explanations, it can sound farcical. And judges, like all of us, a jury member and a judge are also asked to use the common sense. So that's the thing, when you hear judges sum up to a jury, they say, use your common sense, your understanding of the world. That's a valid thing, judgment to be brought into this case. And often people do, and it's to their detriment,
Yeah, no, I just recall sitting when Freddie Thompson was up on trial for the murder of David Daithí Douglas.
Yeah.
And as his counsel are entitled to do in his defence, they put up a defence that his human rights were violated by the fact that CCTV of him had been collected around the city.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, seriously, your human rights are violated and you're being accused of murder. Do your human rights about not being captured on imagery from cameras come into it at that point? And of course it was not acceptable argument, but you do kind of go, these people are, they're living lawlessly.
Yeah.
They're cheating every system there is going. And when they come to court, they try to use the laws in place and the likes of their data protection rights and their their human rights and all these things, all those things that they didn't afford other people throughout their careers. But Nicky McConnell is going to be sentenced later this month, towards the end of January. Gareth Hutch was a father of a young boy. He was looking to get out of that. I mean, his murder was one of the most comprehensively covered stories of the feud, because of the fact that he was trying to get a residential transfer out of Avondale House, wasn't he? He had his young son living with him and he was feeling exposed there. He'd gone to a local councillor, I think, Niall Ring.
Yeah, he'd gone to Niall Ring and spoke about his fears for his safety. Gareth Hutch had a certain degree of criminality in his past, but at the time of his death certainly wasn't somebody that was regarded as being any sort of top-level criminal figure. As I said, John Hutch was a very sort of quite a loved member of his community, and Gareth Hutch's his family have spoken on a few occasions as people have been convicted. Unlike a lot of the people in these cases, they've come out and spoke openly. He has a couple of sisters who've sort of kept his memory alive, I suppose. So, look, it's very tragic for them, and I suppose they will be, relieved that these court proceedings are at an end finally.
8 years later, yeah. So, right, well, there's the start of a new year for Nicky McConnell, facing life in prison.
Yeah.
So that's the end of one career there. Okay, Niall, thanks a million.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.